Hello Internet, I'm Zahn, and welcome back to another episode of Drawing Commentary. Now, it's been quite a while since the last one of these I did. I think technically the last time I did one of these episodes was for the retrospective, if you will, for the design work that I did way back at the beginning of the year. As of the time of recording this, it's currently June of 2018. So it's been a little while. I haven't done a full-length commentary video of the drawing process in what seems like a lot longer. So I figured it'd be good to get back into that, and get back to talking through the process, and taking a look at how things have sort of evolved from a drawing perspective. And for today's experiment, I'm going to be drawing a character that's pretty well known, I think, especially amongst people that play video games. And if you've been following any of the recent news, especially with E3 that happened at the beginning of the month, it'll probably be a little bit more fresh in people's minds. But the character that I'm going to be attempting to draw and design for him today is Ridley from the Metroid series. Now, for those who may not have played the games or don't know much about the character, Ridley is sort of one of the main antagonists of the series. He's shown up in almost every single one of the games in some iteration or another, and always serves to be kind of like the main adversary of Samus whenever she's playing through the games, and he shows up as one of the main bosses. And so I thought, with the recent announcement that we got at E3 that Ridley's finally going to be included in the new Smash Brothers game, it'd be a good opportunity to try and draw him in, I guess, emblem format for my particular drawing style, and also take a look at how his design has sort of evolved over the years, because across the different games he's seen a lot of changes, and I'm going to focus on the most iconic design that people remember, which would have been started in Super Metroid. So before I actually get into the drawing itself, I'll do some real quick overview of the concept work and what we've got to work with as far as Ridley goes. So what I'm going to do is pull over an image, which was my first recollection of Ridley, because I didn't play the original Metroid on NES to completion. I played it off and on back in the days on NES, but I never fully completed it, and I don't think I got to Ridley in that particular game. But on Super Nintendo, when we got Super Metroid a handful of years later, this particular design that we're looking at here is taken from that game. In fact, Ridley makes an appearance on the cover of the box art for Super Metroid, and he sort of, his presence in the game is thrown out immediately, and he's one of the first creatures you encounter in the sort of prologue to the game, and later on you actually fight him as one of the main bosses. Now, taking a look at his design here, the core concept of Ridley has always been that he's some sort of alien dragon. I think this is the only game where he has this sort of red color palette in concept art. You fight him in the game, he's more purple, which we'll get to in a sec. But his basic design is that he's a mostly bipedal, winged dragon. He's got some kind of pteranodon elements with the shape of his head, kind of narrow, bony structures with his neck and his limbs. And one thing that we'll see in some of the other drawings that I pulled up for reference here, his tail, which is this sort of long pointed blade, seems to borrow a lot of themes from the Xenomorph, from the Alien franchise, as far as the texturing and the sort of shell-like look. And I think they sort of took that theme and ran with it later and really built it into his design, especially once we got into the normal palette. At least as Ridley exists as more currently. So let me pull over a more up-to-date picture. Now, this one is a bit more color-wise what we've seen in the more recent games. I don't know off the top of my head where this one came from, before I sat down to work on this particular project, I went on the internet and just grabbed some real quick images of Ridley. Some of them are fan-made, some of them are concept art from the original games, like that last one. But if you look at here, he's still got the same basic shape. Again, like a bipedal dragon with wings. He's got the slightly shortened skull instead of the long crest-like thing in the previous one. But here, his palette's a lot more consistent with what we've seen more recently with the purple. And one thing that's interesting on this particular drawing, I don't know if this is from one of the Game Boy games or the portable games, but his body has a lot less texture on it. He's more fleshy, still pretty thin and muscly, but he doesn't have that texturing and that sort of contour about his skin that looks kind of like a shell. So this one he looks more like just a regular dragon as opposed to sort of alien dragon. But overall, the main core concepts are here, and you can see he still has this sort of ridging and sharp edges along his tail, and the end is this triangular pointed blade. Now, I'm going to pull up his most recent design, which would have been when they announced him for Smash Brothers. And this is taken from the in-game render, I believe. This is how his character model appears in the game itself. And they've taken a lot of the basic elements and more or less kept them intact. One thing I notice is that his body goes back to this more bony, plated, almost like an exoskeleton type thing, especially here. This patterning on his ribs is definitely reminiscent of the xenomorph designs from the Alien series. And he has this sort of variation in color. It almost looks like you can see different parts of his flesh underneath this outer shell throughout his body, his legs. Can't really see it from here on his arms, but his head is back to the more elongated, plated skull. He's got more spikes on like the brow ridges here and the edges of his skull. So that's definitely a little bit different than the other incarnations that we saw for Ridley. If I were to just pull over the Super Metroid one for comparison purposes real quick, you could see that they added more detail on his head with the spikes and the sort of ridges. His neck is a little bit less elongated in the original Super Nintendo concept art. He's got this sort of multi-jointed, long, bony neck, and they shortened it a little bit for the Smash Brothers model. It's kind of hard to tell because of the angle, but his neck kind of comes down here, and then it widens out as it intersects with his torso. So instead of being like an appendage, it's just more of a kind of narrow muscle neck that connects with his skull here. And the wings on the newer concept art, they added the sort of spikes at the end of his wing arms, and he's got sort of almost like a insect-like texturing on the inside of the wings, which is kind of different from what we've seen on the other ones. Instead of it being like skin, it's almost like a bug wing. And other than that, his face, if we go back to the face and look at his mouth, they added this sort of recessed part, which has been on some of the other versions I've seen as well, but they made it much more pronounced, probably to give attention to his eyes and make him look more sunken in. But then his jaws are more jagged, and then he has the teeth and the tongue, versus on the old version it's more smooth, like a dinosaur, a winged dinosaur's mouth, just the fangs running along the top and bottom. So it seems like they wanted to go with a bit more of a monster-like design instead of a straight dragon or dinosaur design. I actually like this sort of redesign of Ridley. It definitely makes him look pretty menacing. His proportions are pretty consistent. Looks like his tail, they sort of reimagined the bony sections of his tail. So instead of it being this ring texture, it's a lot more segmented. It probably lends itself much more to the xenomorph elements. And then for the tail, he has this sort of inverted blade instead of the delta-shaped triangle that he's had on a couple of his other designs. So I think between these two, we could probably take a lot of the elements from the older designs and the more recent designs and sort of combine them into one when we're working on the emblem form for Ridley here. So I think we're good to jump in. I'll be keeping the reference images off on my other screen here, and we'll be working in our main window in Rhino just like we usually do. And just like we've done on some of the other designs, things like the Monster Hunter design specifically, what I'd like to do is start with the basic pose for Ridley and see kind of how we want to take his design elements and start with what I guess would be considered the primary phase. So what I'm going to do, and this is pretty consistent with the way I usually do things in the speed drawings or whatever I'm working on, I'm going to start with some basic shapes and sketch out the details for the skeleton, and then I'll probably play around with the poses a little bit until I get one that I think I want, and then I'll start filling in the details as we go. And we'll do kind of rough shapes, and then I'll be able to move them around as I see fit. And right here, starting at the head, I'm just going to do these really basic shapes. This is not going to be the final by any means, but it'll give me sort of a starting point to work off of when I'm messing around with all of the other parts. So this sort of banana shape is his head. His neck is probably going to be shortened a little bit, but I'll keep it like that for now, and I'll play with the proportions as I sort of go here. I think something a bit more dynamic than that Smash Brothers render that shows him sort of standing in a combat pose. Wouldn't mind going for something a little bit more ambitious, but we'll see as we go here. These circles moving down the body, I definitely think keeping the more streamlined bipedal type shape that they've had for Ridley is going to be a must as far as making sure I'm staying as on model as possible. We don't want to get too crazy with the design. It's not supposed to be a reimagining of the character. So let's try and experiment with the pose itself. I think a sort of mid-air leaping pose would be pretty cool for Ridley here. But I'm trying to visualize in my head the best way to do that. And his neck, thankfully, because of the way it bends, I can mostly just rotate it around whatever I end up doing for the final pose. And that shouldn't cause too many issues since it's very angular. If I wanted to, I could bend it and rotate it around the sort of joint. He has like almost like an elbow in his neck, which is kind of an unusual design, but he's supposed to be an alien, so there are no rules. But if we were to move down the torso, he's got pretty moderately sized legs. They're not long and spindly. They kind of are in some of his older concept art, but in the Smash Brothers one, he's got pretty human proportioned arms and legs. So I'll try and meet in the middle as far as that goes. I would like to have this being sort of a mid-air, maybe like a leaping pose would work well. We can see it's going to be a little bit tricky since he's got wings. And I don't want to have the wings be overshadowed by anything else or hidden. So that's going to be a challenge too. This here is just a primary placeholder for the wings. I understand that his wings don't look like this. I'm just putting them here for the sake of the pose. Right away, I could tell that the wings are going to be probably going to have to be on a separate layer and be behind him. Because right now, due to the nature of how I do these designs, if I were to draw these on the same layer, I'd have to either cut out sections of the wings to make space for his face and his neck, or I would have to move them in a way so that they weren't blocking his face. So let's, and I guess his arm as well would also intersect with the wings. So that might be an issue. To keep that in mind as we narrow in on the pose and how we want our space dragon to sort of look. What I'll do is continue working with the legs and try and see just the basic shapes, what kind of pose we have. Again, going for the whole mid-air pose. I like that idea. He's sort of jumping mid-air. Maybe we can change the way that his torso's aligned so it looks like he's kind of leaping this direction. Right now he's kind of leaping up. And probably not going to stay in this particular angle, but we'll know more once I get the basic details ironed out here. And I'll just add these placeholders. His toes are not that big. That can be scaled down a little bit. That's better. If we were to take his other leg. Again, the point of the primary work is to just start with a really basic shape and get the specifics as far as the general details, and then we kind of work downwards from there. So there's going to be quite a bit of placeholder work here. Just fine. I'd much rather get everything as far as the pose goes down, so I don't have to go back and mess around with it too much once we actually start going in and drawing the specific details on Ridley here. Forearms. Forearms are decently sized, but they're not overly long. I think his limb to body proportions are more or less human-like. His arms and legs might be a little bit longer than you see on a human, but that's okay. He's got 3 fingers and a thumb. Interestingly enough, he's got 2 toes and 1 heel talon here. They've seemed to have kept that difference in digits consistent across all the different games too. I guess that's become kind of one of the required design elements for Ridley here. So we'll make sure and keep that consistent. Okay. So basically, I think this particular pose is... I don't know if I like the way the directions are sort of conveyed with his legs bent in different directions like that. So this might actually work better. I think I already like how that looks better than before. This makes it look like he's sort of jumping away from something while still keeping his attention focused on whatever he's fighting. So this could be a dodging pose or something like that. I think that looks a lot better than with his legs sort of bent inwards. So we can sort of keep that for now. And I think we need to move his legs down his lower torso there. Again, the placement doesn't have to be final, but I would like for the primary to be as consistent as possible so it doesn't cause issues once I actually start drawing in the different sections of the body here. Because looking at the concept art, both the old school Super Nintendo and the most recent Smash Brothers concept art really doesn't have a long body. He's sort of hunched over in some of the older concept art, and he has this kind of raised ridge along his back. But even with the more humanoid redesign in Smash Brothers, his torso is pretty compact, and I definitely want to keep that consistent here. So if I stretch it out too much, he'll look kind of more snake-like, which isn't really the point. And I'll have to put in a placeholder for his tail. His tail is definitely an important part of the design. And I think what I'll end up doing for the actual segments is doing a series of divided up sections, and then I'll bend it into place like I've done on some other designs. I think that'll probably be easier than trying to draw the sections out by hand. But we'll see how that ends up playing out. Because right now his tail's sort of wrapping around and trailing behind him. I could have his tail going in front of him like this. But I feel like with his direction, that wouldn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense with him sort of leaping up in this direction and his tail going in that direction. It would make more sense if it was following his momentum. I don't know if I like that as much. But we can sort of play around with that once we get there. Now, his wings. I'm already starting to see that these wings might be a little problematic. Let's see if we can try rotating them. I wouldn't mind working with the idea of having his wings sort of flared upwards. I'm just playing around with some alternate positioning on his wings to see how that looks. A little bit hard to tell. Yeah, that looks a little bit too compact. This problem could be negated relatively easily by just making the wings a separate layer and then differentiating them slightly in color. But I don't want it to look like his wings are pasted on either. So I wonder what the best way to deal with that would be. If I move his neck further out and have it sort of joining with his torso right here, and the central through line of his body would go like this with him facing forwards. I wonder if I can actually angle his head down a little bit more. I think even with that particular angle, his neck is still too long, I think. But if we were to do that and then placeholder, his lower jaw. Here, the question is, where would it make sense to draw in his other wing? Because I don't want it to take away from his face. A lot of the specific details that make Ridley recognizable are going to have to be in his face. So if I put too much around it, then that could be a problem as well. Yeah, that's not too bad. I feel like maybe if I scale his wings down a little bit, then I'll take up a little less real estate. Yeah, that looks okay, but I would have to cut out a lot of space around his wings for the neck, face, and also for this hand. So what that would basically look like is his wing would sort of cut around here. And we'll just do that really basically here. So we'd have these cutout sections of his wings around his hands and his head. And I don't know if I like that. I've done that before on other designs where we've had intersecting parts on different parts of the body, but I don't know if I want to do that here. Again, I could get around this by just layering the wings behind him and differentiating the color slightly so that they show up. I'm gonna have to think about that. I think I'm mostly satisfied with the pose. But the wings... those wings are gonna be a problem, I think. But we can... wait for now. We've got the general pose for his body. So I think we're good to start actually drawing in the specific details of his face and torso, and then his arms and legs and tail. And then I guess as that sort of comes together, I'll revisit the wings last and sort of see how to fit everything together. Alright, now the fun part. What I'm going to do is leave the primary pose here, and I'm going to actually start drawing his face over here. And just like many artists do when working on a piece, I usually start at the eye and then sort of work my way around the different details and I guess work outwards, as it were. Now Ridley has long, sort of pointed jaws, and he's got a pretty defined brow. So I think I can work with that a little bit. I definitely want to keep this sectioned off part that we talked about earlier consistent, since it's been a major focal point in most of the designs that are more current than the Super Nintendo, so I definitely want to keep that. And I guess I'll put the nostril for his nose right around here. I'll probably make that more ellipsoid in shape instead of a circle. We'll keep it there for now. And I like the idea that his jaws are sort of more jagged in the recent concept art. And if we were to go a little bit further past his head, definitely looks like his lower jaw is attached underneath his skull. So what we'll do is draw that separately, and probably come down from around here. Before we do that, I want to get his eye placement squared away and then working on the details. I think his eye might be too big. The whole sunken in texture for his eye does a pretty good job of making him look menacing. His Super Nintendo version was pretty neat to look at, but it wasn't imposing. I didn't feel intimidated by Ridley in that artwork, but I felt like it still captured his core design, which is obviously what the illustrators are going for. It seemed like as the games went on and he kept showing up, they wanted to make him look a lot more imposing and intimidating than, I think, making those sorts of changes to his face definitely helped for that. And I haven't read the Metroid manga, but I do remember in the Nintendo Power issues, they had a comic series that basically followed the events of Super Metroid. I think it was Super Metroid. And Ridley was one of the main antagonists in that as well, and he was portrayed as this sort of cunning leader of the space pirates, not just this monstrous creature. So you have him exchanging words with Samus and ordering around the different space pirates. And I think he gets away. I don't think he actually gets killed by Samus in the comic. And they sort of went with his design from Super Metroid in the comics as well. He retains a lot of the color paletting, and it might have been purple. It's been a long time since I've read that. But it was sort of a in-between design-wise compared to what we saw in, I guess would it be Prime on the GameCube? And then in other things like Zero Mission, his quote-unquote reappearance in Fusion, and then everything else, Other M. I don't think I pulled any concept art from Other M for this particular project, but it's probably for the best since fans of the series don't really like to talk about Other M on the Wii that much. That game didn't do the franchise any favors, I think. But Ridley does show up in that. He's more or less intact with all of his other versions. Some minor differences, but nothing too dramatic as far as design goes. Alright. Adding in the texturing on his upper jaw. I think I'll probably keep that same type of patterning. Fix this down here. One thing that I've noticed tends to happen on the Monster Hunter designs, I follow the same process as far as the basic primary work and then starting on the head and working outwards. A lot of times the heads will have more detail than the bodies and limbs of whatever I'm drawing. So I want to try and not make that mistake again here and keep things consistent. That way it doesn't look like all the details on one part of the actual drawing. And let's see, going up his brow, he's got these spikes that go up. I think what I'll do is sort of combine what we saw on the Super Nintendo version with the more recent changes on the Smash Brothers version. So what that means is I'm going to put some spikes going out here, and then we'll divide this up, make some accent lines here. I think for for this particular design, I'm going to probably have to play around with the specific details and figure out what I'm going to keep and what I'm going to discard, since, again, we're trying to sort of combine elements from the old design and the more recent designs and come up with something in between. So in the new design, I know they put some spikes out here. So what we'll do is we'll put 2 right here. Now let's work on his lower jaw. His lower jaw is pretty thin. It looks like when his mouth is closed, it lies up against his upper jaw and it'd be hidden against the sort of ridges that go up from the outside edges of his mouth. So let's see, based on that. I'll go back all the way here. I think I can actually move this forward. Since again it'll be folding under his upper jaw. So what we can do is make it sort of flush instead of jutting outwards. I'm going to divide up the sections here and here. And I think I'll add a little bit more on the underside so it just doesn't look like a single piece. I think they could probably pull this in a little bit. There, that sort of cleans the lines up a little bit, and then a little bit here. Okay. In the older designs for his teeth, they gave him almost like bird teeth, a bunch of small narrow fangs that went all the way along the top and bottom of his jaw. Smash Brothers one, they made him a little bit bigger and triangular, almost like shark teeth with not as many. So I think for this one, I'm going to kind of split the difference a little bit and make them longer, but still somewhat triangular. And instead of him having, looks like 4 on the top and 5 on the bottom, I'm going to give him a lot more teeth. And we'll do the same for the bottom. Using the handy dandy mirror tool, which I use very frequently on these designs. Fix this here. Okay. And now what I can do is use my control point editing, and actually fix the positioning on all those, so they're not just pasted in up here. Look like they're actually following the contours of the mouth. Like so. And then now we can add some variation to the length, so they are not all the same size. I have them sort of curving backwards a little bit, which is fine. But I also want to make sure that they're not all pointing in different directions, which would Be kind of unusual. And we'll shorten this one up. And then we'll do the same thing on the bottom here. We'll fix the, I guess, the gum line. And then we'll add some variation in size, just like we did on the top. And that should do it for his mouth. Overall, not too much. Oh, I remember. Before we finish up here, one thing I need to do is add his tongue. That is consistent across all the different designs. And I definitely don't want to leave that out. The question is, his tongue starts at the back of his mouth. But I don't think I want to have it intersecting all the way back there, because then it'll be sort of distracting if I do that. We'll see how this looks, and I can always alter the position later if I don't like the way it actually looks in the final. What I'm doing here is I'm just cutting out the sections around his teeth so that the tongue's not overlapping. I just need to do that for 3 of them. And then we'll just trim out the sections here. And here. And that should do it for his mouth. Alright. Now we can move our way up further to this sort of elongated skull thing that he's got. Definitely think this particular part of Ridley's design, which has been consistent across all his different incarnations, I would be very surprised if they hadn't taken a lot of this design specifically from the xenomorphs. I know he's kind of a pteranodon dinosaur dragon, which they have this bony crest thing on their head too. But given how heavily influenced the Metroid series is by the Alien franchise, it would not surprise me one bit if when they were doing the redesigns for Ridley, they said, well, we like the design from the Xenomorphs, so we definitely want to carry that through here, which I think is a pretty good choice, personally. I, as also pretty big fan of the Xenomorph design and their different appearances, I think it makes for a pretty memorable combination of design elements, especially given Ridley's role in the story. It's kind of a neat nod to that bit of sci-fi pop culture. And so I definitely want to make sure that I'm capturing that particular part of his design, since it's one of the most noteworthy things in all of the different forms for Ridley. What I've done here is created the dividing sections. He has these bony ridges that run along the length of his skull here. So what I did was start with that, and then I'm going to need to fill in some details so that there isn't as much empty space. And that'll be pretty easy to do just by running this part along here. And I think, think I'm gonna put another accent line that goes along this way, divide it up a little bit so that the sections aren't quite as blocky. We'll do that by copying this part down, and then I'll just go back and trim out all the stuff in between. Though I think I need to fix this part. Make it a little bit more consistent with the curve shape there. Now what we'll do is just trim this out, and I think we're almost done with his head. I think once I get to the body, it's going to be a little bit more challenging getting all of the texture work on his body. We'll get there in a sec. I think I'll add some sections here. And then I think that'll do it. You can always come back to different parts that we worked on previously if something jumps out at me or I need to change something. Okay. I think that'll do for his head. Let's make sure and save. And then we'll... I guess I'll join these into one set for now, and if I need to change anything else, I can always split them apart. So if we scale down his head, it's a little too small. I'm gonna have to figure out, take this out of here. Figure out the right proportions for his head, but I think that'll do for now. All right, now we're good to go on fleshing out the different parts of his body. So if we were to create his neck, which, going off of the more recent artwork, again, it's not quite as bony. It actually does sort of widen out as it gets closer to his torso itself. What we can do is keep this the way it is now, and then if I see a need to change it later, I can always do that. But I think that'll work for our purposes here. What we'll do is we'll add the texturing here, and I may have to move the whole thing further in so that it's actually intersecting with the center of his body. Do this first. So now we're going to move on to his actual torso. I realize it's taken a little bit just to get this far in the drawing, but I think now that we're moving on to the body, it's not going to take quite as long because I'll be able to do things like mirror the limbs and everything else. Okay. This. Get rid of that. Now, Ridley's overall body design on both the old Super Nintendo artwork and the more recent redesigns definitely have this sort of bony structure that bounds his body. It's very reminiscent of the sort of exoskeleton that the xenomorphs have. Again, I'll probably be pointing that out more than I need to since it's relatively obvious, but you can definitely see the influence the Xenomorph franchise has had on at least Ridley himself. So I think what I'll do is, this is going to be challenging, I think. So I'm doing a bit of guesswork here. I definitely like the idea of having these different sections. I wonder if it'd be easier just to do this on the axis so I know how to mirror it, but I guess it's fine like this. I may have to trim out some of the stuff in the middle when I eventually flip this across the axis, but that's okay. For now, I just want to get the basic shape so that I can start deleting the initial primary stuff. Part of the challenge here is going to be making the lines connect and make sure that everything is sort of following a consistent path and patterning, if that makes any sense. So maybe what we can do is pull this off of the primary, because I'm getting a lot of interference from the primary circle stuff that I put down in the beginning. So what we'll do is we'll move this off, and then hopefully that'll help zero in on some of the details. And if that doesn't work, I can sort of take the design and draw it on the axis so that I can mirror it a little bit easier, then I'll just move it into place. So let's see, if we were to mirror it across here, we'd get this. Okay, yeah, I think that'll work. I'll just need to connect the center sections since I've mirrored them a bit too far, but that's okay. We'll do this a little bit differently than I normally do. I think I've kind of got in the habit of doing all of my mirror work on the axis just because it's safer that way, but we'll experiment a little bit for the sake of our friend Ridley here. We'll divide that section up. We'll add some texture in here. And then now we need to clean this up a little bit. So what we have, what I've sort of done is I've simplified the patterning on this rib light protection plating thing he has. But then I'm going to go back in and add some more detail to divide up the sections. So hopefully it'll still have that kind of rigid, bony look to it, but it won't quite be identical. Because, well, from a design perspective, I want to make sure we're capturing all of the specific elements that make Ridley who he is. I want to kind of merge in some of the different things across his older and newer designs. So, it'd be kind of like a slightly different take on the character, but it won't be dramatically different. Wouldn't want to go too far off model. let's see. Let's see how that looks. I like the way this lower section sticks out. That might work a little bit better. Add some lines to divide up this section over here. I think this is going to leave a sort of gap at the center of his body that I can fill in after I mirror this whole thing. So, keep that there until the end. And then I think I want to divide up this section here, but I won't use the same patterning as the quote-unquote ribs. That way I'll have some variation. And then all we have to do is check the mirrored version, and then we should be good to go to move this into place and keep on moving down the body here. I think what I'll do is add the same dividing sections here. Okay. I think that will do. Now, the question is going to be, how much of this do I want to mirror? If we did it that way, we could trim out part of the bottom. I think that'll actually work okay. Let's see. I'm trying to think of how to divide up the middle. I think if we just go end to end and then I add sort of a central piece along the middle, that'll do. And then we could just trim this part out down the bottom, and then I think his torso, or his chest piece here, will be done. Looking at the timestamp on the recording footage, this is going to be another long episode. It's been kind of a while since I've done one of these, and I happened to pick a rather complicated subject to draw. That's okay. Okay, now I have to get the placement of this right, and then I have to fit his neck on here. I might have to bend this actually because of, yeah, that might work a little bit better. Trying to follow the through line on his body. And then what I can do here, move this up, and then cut out this section to actually have his neck intersecting with his torso. And that should do it. Delete the primary here. And the primary here. And I'll leave this for now. We'll have to draw the sections moving down towards his midsection. But I think we are making some progress here.